Alright, here goes. I never thought I'd be sharing this kind of story. Feels like something out of a soap opera. But this is my life, and I guess writing it out might help me process it all. So, here it is. I'm Archie, 25. Been married to my wife, Judy, for about a year. We're both young and had what felt like a solid relationship. We'd been talking about the future, making all these plans to get our first house, maybe start a family one day. The normal dreams you share with someone you're supposed to trust. But looking back, maybe I was the only one in this for real. Now, Judy's always been determined, I'll give her that. So when she told me she was finally going to learn to drive, I was on board. I wanted to help her out with whatever she needed, so I encouraged her and even offered to pay for the lessons. Figured it was one of those things we'd both benefit from, having her able to get around on her own. Anyway, she took her first test and failed. She was disappointed, but I tried to cheer her up, telling her it was just one test and not a big deal. Then she'd failed a second time, and a third. Every time, she'd come home looking a little upset and frustrated, saying how hard it was and how she needed to keep trying. Of course, I didn't think much of it at first. She said the instructor was really strict and that it was just bad luck she didn't pass. I shrugged it off. I trusted her. So whenever she'd tell me she needed cash for more lessons or another test retake, I gave it to her, no questions asked. After all, it was just driving lessons, right? But then, things started to feel off. It's hard to describe, but you know that nagging feeling in the back of your head, like something isn't adding up? That's what I felt. But I pushed it down, thinking maybe I was just overanalyzing things. It wasn't until one of my close buddies gave me a heads up that things really hit home. One day, out of nowhere, he called me up, his voice kind of hesitant. He told me, "Look man, I hate to say this, but I saw Judy getting out of our neighbor's car and going inside his house." He didn't want to make me feel bad, but he figured I should know. Now, the neighbor was this guy I'd seen around, a bit older, always had his car spotless, that kind of guy. Not someone I'd ever expect to be mixed up in my life, let alone in my marriage. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself maybe she was just borrowing a cup of sugar or something. But it didn't sit right with me. So when she came home that night, I asked her how her day went. She gave me the usual line about how the lesson was tough, how the instructor was strict. She said she'd be getting it soon though, just needed 1 or 2 more sessions. When she asked for another retake fee, I handed over the cash and played along. But I knew right then I needed proof. I called my friend back and asked if he'd be willing to help me get some solid evidence. He was hesitant, saying he didn't want to be the one to come between us, but eventually, he agreed. It wasn't long before he had something for me, a short video clip. He sent it over, and I sat down to watch, feeling my stomach twist into knots. I was hoping, somehow, that it'd show nothing. But it was all there. Judy was walking with some guy into a hotel room, all smiles and holding hands like they were on a date. That moment hit me like a freight train. The reality sank in. My wife had been lying to me for months. She was using my money, my trust, and probably my time to sneak off with this guy. Once I saw that video, everything changed. I felt like a fool, like I'd been living in some fake reality while everyone else probably saw the truth clear as day. Here I was, paying for her driving lessons, while she was off sneaking around with some guy, living it up in hotel rooms. It's hard to describe what I felt in that moment. It was anger, sure, but mixed with this deep sadness I didn't expect. I replayed the video a couple of times, not because I wanted to see it, but because I couldn't look away. Watching her act all cozy with someone else burned me up inside. The worst part was seeing that look on her face, the one that was supposed to be for me. That was it. I knew I couldn't let this slide. I needed to do something, but I wanted to be smart about it. Over the next few days, I acted like everything was normal. I kept smiling, kept pretending that I was the oblivious husband who didn't suspect a thing. Judy didn't have a clue that I knew. She'd come home, make small talk about herb lessons, and even ask for more cash for the next one. And every time she asked, I'd give it to her, all the while feeling a little more certain about what I was going to do. I started planning it out in my head, trying to think of every angle. I didn't want to just confront her. I wanted to hit her where it'd hurt most, where she couldn't talk her way out or twist the truth. I figured if she was bold enough to lie to my face, I could be just as bold back. The idea of a public showdown started to take shape, but I didn't want to humiliate myself in the process. I needed something more controlled. Then it came to me, a private movie night. Judy loved watching movies together, said it was our thing. So I decided I'd make that the stage for her grand reveal. I spent a whole evening getting everything ready. I put all her things into boxes and piled them up near the front door. I knew that once I showed her what I had, there was no way she was staying under my roof. I was ending this for good. I made sure everything was neatly packed, like I was doing her some kind of favor, even though I was barely holding it together on the inside. When she got home that night, I greeted her like usual and even offered to make her favorite snack. I told her I'd set up a movie, and she seemed pretty happy about it, talking about how it had been too long since we just relaxed together. I had to bite my tongue to stop myself from laughing at the irony of it. I kept my cool while we settled down on the couch. She had no idea what was coming. With the remote in my hand, I gave her a little smile and said, "Hope you enjoy the show." Then, instead of the movie, I hit play on the video my friend had taken. The screen lit up, and there it was, Judy, all wrapped up in someone else's arms, walking into that hotel. At first, she didn't react. She just stared at the screen, like she couldn't understand what she was seeing. But slowly, her face turned pale, and I could see the panic start to set in. She tried to say something, probably some excuse or lie, but I raised my hand to stop her. "Save it, Judy," I said. "I know everything. Every lesson, every retake, every single dollar I handed over while you were off cheating on me." She opened her mouth, then closed it, scrambling to think of something, anything to say. But I didn't give her the chance. I pointed over to the front door, where her bags were packed and waiting. "You wanted to spend time with him so badly? Go ahead. Take your things and don't come back." I watched her face go from shock to anger to something like desperation, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I was in control. She tried to argue, say something about how it wasn't what it looked like, but I just shook my head. "Your family already knows, Judy. My family knows. Our friends know. This is it. You can leave now, or I can drag you out myself." And that's when she knew I was serious. I stood there, waiting, as she gathered her things and walked out the door, her head down. It was over. Just like that, I'd closed the book on a chapter one never wanted to read in the first place. Once she was gone, I sat back down on the couch, feeling a weird mix of relief and emptiness. I knew this wasn't the end of the story, but for now, I was finally free. The house was dead quiet after she left. I didn't expect it to feel that way, but it hit me hard. You'd think after everything I'd just been through, I'd feel some kind of victory or satisfaction. But I just felt hollow. I looked around at the boxes she'd left behind, some random stuff she didn't even bother to take. For a second, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should have tried to work it out, but then I remembered that video, the way she looked so comfortable with him. I shook the thought right out of my head. The next few days were rough. I didn't tell a lot of people what happened, just my closest friends and family who already knew something was off. I didn't want to deal with the questions or the pity. Whenever someone asked where Judy was, I'd say we were taking a break and leave it at that. I wasn't ready to open up the can of worms that was my life to everyone. Judy tried reaching out a few times. She sent a couple of texts saying things like, "Can we talk?" or "This isn't what you think," but I ignored every single one. I'd already heard enough lies to last me a lifetime. She even tried calling me once, but when her number popped up, I couldn't bring myself to answer. I knew if I picked up, I'd end up sucked right back in, listening to her twist the truth and play the victim. So I blocked her, hoping that would be the end of it. One night, about a week after everything went down, I met up with my friend, the same one who'd helped me gather the proof. We went to our usual spot, a quiet little bar that never got too crowded. I needed to vent, to say all the stuff I couldn't say to anyone else. As soon as we sat down, he asked, "How you holding up, man?" I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. It's weird, honestly. Half of me feels like I dodged a bullet, and the other half is still trying to wrap my head around it. He nodded, understanding. "I know it's gotta be hard, but you did the right thing. She didn't deserve you." We sat there for hours, going over everything that happened. I told him about the fake driving lessons, the hotel meetups, And that final confrontation. He listened, never interrupting, just letting me get it all out. At some point, the bartender came over and gave us both a sympathetic look, like he knew what was going on. "You know," my friend said, taking a sip of his drink, "I've never understood why people like her even bother getting married. If you're not in it for real, why not just stay single?" That question stuck with me. I had no answers, just more questions that probably didn't have answers. It was exhausting to even think about, but I couldn't help myself. My mind kept running back over every memory, wondering if there were other red flags I'd missed, other signs I'd been blind to. Then my friend said something that changed things a little. "You're free now, Archie. I know it hurts, but look at it this way, you don't have to worry about her sneaking around anymore. You're finally in control." That hit home. He was right. All this time, I'd been focused on what I lost, but I hadn't thought about what I'd gained. I didn't have to walk on eggshells anymore, wondering if she was lying to my face. I didn't have to keep giving to someone who was just taking from me. For the first time in a while, I felt a weight lift. I wasn't there yet, not even close, but I could see a glimmer of something better ahead. I realized I didn't have to figure it all out right away. I just needed to take one step at a time to start putting the pieces back together, and to remind myself that I was still here, still standing. When I got home that night, the house didn't feel as empty as it had before. I knew there was a long road ahead, but I'd taken the first steps, and that was enough for now. A few weeks had passed since the last of the drama with Judy. I'd settled into some kind of routine, though it felt strange to be alone. I'd come home from work, toss my stuff down, and the silence would greet me. No more wondering where she was or if she'd been lying to my face about her day. I'd have my dinner alone, watch whatever I wanted, and go to bed without the weight of someone else's secrets pressing down on me. But one evening, just as I'd sat down to watch a show and unwind, I heard a knock at the door. The sound instantly made me uneasy. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there she was, Judy, standing on the porch, looking like she'd been debating whether to knock in the first place. She looked different somehow, like the confident air she'd always had been knocked out of her. "Archie, can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a second, I didn't say anything. Part of me wanted to slam the door, and I almost did. But I figured I'd at least hear her out, so I stepped back and motioned for her to come in. She walked inside slowly, her eyes taking in the changes, probably noticing that her things weren't here anymore, that the space was different. We sat down, but I kept a distance. I wanted her to know that whatever she'd come to say, I wasn't here to make things easy for her. "I know you're hurt," she started, her voice shaky. "I don't expect you to understand, but I just wanted to try to explain." I raised an eyebrow, not buying it. "Explain? Judy, what's there to explain? You lied, you took advantage of my trust, and then you threw it back in my face. I don't think I need to hear any more than that." She looked down, fidgeting with her hands. I don't know, Archie, I felt trapped. I know it sounds terrible, but I just felt like I wasn't myself anymore. I thought maybe if I could just, I don't know, feel something different, maybe things would get better with us. I let out a bitter laugh. "So your solution was to sneak around behind my back and lie to my face? That's how you were going to fix things?" She flinched, but didn't argue. "I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't hit like they might have weeks ago. I felt almost detached from it all, like I was listening to someone else's story. I leaned back, crossing my arms as I looked at her. "Judy, the time to be honest was a long time ago. Whatever you felt, whatever you wanted, none of it matters now. You made your choice." She nodded, looking defeated, as if she'd hoped for some miracle that might undo everything. "I know. I thought maybe if I explained, you'd understand." "Understand?" I repeated, shaking my head. "Judy, I understand perfectly. You weren't happy, so you did what you wanted. You didn't care who got hurt along the way. I've moved on now. I don't need closure from you. I found it on my own." She sat there, stunned, as if she didn't know what to say. For a second, I thought she'd argue, but instead, she just looked down, then back up at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm really sorry, Archie." I nodded, feeling strangely calm. "I know you are. But that doesn't change anything." She gave a small nod and stood up, glancing around one last time before heading toward the door. She paused for a moment, maybe waiting for me to say something, to ask her to stay. But I didn't. I stayed right where I was, watching her leave just as easily as she'd come back. When the door closed behind her, I took a deep breath and realized something. I was free. I didn't need to hold on to anything else from her. That chapter was finally closed, and I could move forward, just me and the peace I'd fought hard to get back. After Judy left that last time, it was like the final knot had been untied. I felt lighter, even though the house still felt too big and the quiet too sharp. I was trying to focus on myself, on what came next. For the first time in years, I didn't have to think about anyone but myself, and it felt strange, like wearing someone else's coat. I didn't know if it suited me yet, but I was determined to make it fit. In the weeks that followed, I started making small changes around the house. I boxed up the last of her things and left them in storage, deciding I'd figure out what to do with them later. Rearranging the living room, adding a few things I'd always wanted but never got around to buying, I was marking the place as mine. I swapped out the photos on the walls for ones with friends and family, a small but significant step toward putting myself back in the center of my own life. I started going out more, catching up with friends I hadn't seen in a while, people I'd drifted from during my marriage. They welcomed me back without questions, and we picked up where we left off, as if no time had passed. Nights spent at local bars or someone's backyard, talking about work, sports, life. It was a kind of simple comfort I'd missed without even realizing it. Eventually, I even took up an old hobby I'd let go, guitar. I pulled my dusty guitar case out from the back of a closet and started playing again, my fingers finding the strings awkwardly at first, then with more ease. It felt good to dive into something that was just mine, no expectations, no compromises. There was something healing about it, letting music fill the silence Judy had left behind. One day, while clearing out the last drawer that had any of her things, I came across an old photo of us, smiling, wrapped up in each other during better times. For a second, a flicker of sadness crept in, a faint ghost of what we'd once shared. But as I looked closer, I didn't feel the pain that used to come with those memories. Instead, it was just a picture, a part of a life that had come and gone. I placed the photo in a box without hesitation. The house was finally mine again, and I was okay with that. In fact, for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely happy with where I was, alone, but finally at peace. The months rolled by, and with every passing week, I felt more like myself. Life without Judy was starting to feel natural. I wasn't just adjusting. I was thriving in ways I hadn't expected. My job was going well, and I was spending time with people who actually cared about me. Little by little, the bitterness faded, replaced by a feeling I could only describe as relief. One weekend, a friend convinced me to join a group hiking trip. I'd never been one for the outdoors, but I figured, why not? I wanted to keep saying yes to new things, to explore sides of myself that might have been buried under years of compromise and routine. So I bought a pair of hiking boots, packed up, and headed out with the group. The hike was tough, more of a workout than I'd expected, but it was refreshing. Out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air, it felt like I was leaving behind the last remnants of my old life. At some point, I struck up a conversation with one of the group members, a woman named Lily. She had this calm, easygoing presence, the kind of person who didn't take herself too seriously but also didn't miss much. She laughed at my struggle with the steep parts and gave me pointers, making the whole thing feel less daunting. After the hike, our group grabbed lunch, and Lily and I ended up sitting together. We got to talking about our lives, our jobs, and the ridiculous mishaps we'd had on the trail. It felt different from any conversation I'd had in a long time. I wasn't trying to impress her or hide parts of myself. I was just me. We kept in touch after that. I didn't think much of it at first, but soon, casual texts turned into long conversations, and coffee meetups became regular. She was easy to talk to, and there was no pressure, no expectations. For the first time, I felt like I was moving forward, not out of spite or loneliness, but because I genuinely wanted to. It's funny how life works. I wasn't looking for anyone or anything. I was just trying to figure out who I was on my own. But meeting Lily felt like a natural next step, like a door quietly opening on its own, inviting me to take a look inside. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I was excited to find out. My life kept moving forward, and my friendship with Lily continued to grow. There was no rush between us, no expectation beyond enjoying each other's company. We'd meet for coffee, go on hikes, or spend evenings just talking about life. With her, everything felt natural and easy, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. But as I moved forward, I felt the need to finally close the last door on my past. Judy's things were still boxed up in the storage unit, along with reminders of the life I'd left behind. Those boxes sat there, untouched, like a weight I hadn't quite been able to shed. So one Saturday, I decided it was time. I drove to the storage unit, took a deep breath, and pulled up the metal door. There they were, boxes of photos, old clothes, gifts we'd exchanged, mementos from trips we'd taken. Each box held pieces of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I sorted through them, holding each item only long enough to decide if it was worth keeping. Most of it wasn't. Ticket stubs, anniversary cards, and little souvenirs from vacations were reminders of a time I'd already put behind me. Then I came across a journal. It was mine, a small notebook I'd kept during our first few years together. Flipping through its pages, I read notes to myself, thoughts from happier times, and plans for a future I thought we were building. I almost felt like I was reading someone else's words, someone who hadn't known the betrayal that was coming. I closed the journal and placed it in the discard pile without hesitation. I didn't need to hold on to these things anymore. I didn't need to carry around reminders of what could have been. I'd already let go in my heart. Now I was letting go in every other way too. After that day, I felt lighter, like I'd finally cut the last thread binding me to a chapter that had ended long ago. There was no bitterness, no lingering anger. Just a clean slate, a fresh start. I walked out of that storage unit, locked the door behind me, and didn't look back. Back at home, I put away the few items I decided to keep. Just a handful of photos, ones with friends and family, moments that meant something beyond my past with Judy. As I closed the last drawer, I realized I was finally free of everything that had weighed me down. The future was open, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to step into it with both feet. Life was settling into a rhythm I could finally call my own. Work was steady, I was reconnecting with old friends, and Lily and I had found a genuine, easygoing friendship that, I'll admit, was starting to feel like it could be something more. But I wasn't rushing things. I was just taking life as it came, letting myself enjoy the quiet, steady days. Then, one evening, just as I'd gotten home from a long day at work, I got a message notification on my phone. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably one of my friends or a work email. But when I checked the screen, my stomach dropped. It was from Judy. We hadn't spoken since the day she'd come over to apologize, and I'd thought that chapter was long closed. So, seeing her name pop up like that made me uneasy. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the message. It was short, just a few lines. Hey, Archie. I know it's been a while, but I really need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet up? It's urgent. I didn't know what to make of it. Urgent? What could possibly be so urgent between us that she'd break the silence after all these months? My mind spun with possibilities, each one stranger than the last. I wondered if she was in trouble, if she needed help, or if this was some attempt to try to rope me back into her life. I knew better than to get sucked back in, but part of me was genuinely curious about what was so urgent that she'd reach out now. After a minute of staring at the message, I decided to reply. Just one line. What's this about, Judy? I waited, my phone clutched in my hand. Within a few seconds, her response came through. I really need to tell you in person. Please. Archie. It's important. Everything in me screamed that this was a bad idea. But something about the way she'd worded it, the strange urgency of it, tugged at me. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. I needed to know what was so important, if only to finally put whatever it was to rest. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop the next day. As I walked in, I saw her sitting in the corner, looking nervous, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. When she saw me, she gave a small, tentative smile, but I just nodded and took a seat across from her, waiting for her to speak. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Archie, I know I have no right to ask anything of you," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." I braced myself, unsure of what was coming next. But nothing could have prepared me for what she said next. Judy sat across from me, eyes flickering with a strange mix of guilt and hesitation. I'd been prepared for a lot of things, a request for money, some attempt at reconciliation, maybe even a confession about something else that had gone on behind my back. But what she said threw me completely off balance. "Archie, there's something I need to tell you. I know it's probably the last thing you want to hear from me, but," she paused, gripping her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles turned white. "We have a daughter." The words hung in the air, impossible to absorb. A daughter? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I just stared at her, dumbfounded, not even sure if I'd heard her right. She took my silence as a prompt to keep talking, her voice shaky. "She's 6 now. I found out I was pregnant right around the time we started having problems. I didn't tell you because I thought it would only make things worse. So I decided to raise her on my own." She glanced down, looking like she was bracing herself for whatever I might say. I leaned back in my chair, still trying to process the shock. "So you're telling me I have a child? A daughter? And you kept this from me? For 6 years?" She nodded slowly, eyes full of something that looked like regret. "I know it sounds terrible, Archie. I know I hurt you, and I won't make excuses for that. But I thought I was doing the right thing back then. Until now." "Why now?" I managed, the words feeling heavy. She took another deep breath, her voice catching. She's not well. There's something wrong with her kidneys. She needs a transplant. And the doctors think that you could be her best chance." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had a daughter, a child I'd never known existed, a child who was now in danger. I felt anger rising in me, anger at Judy for keeping this from me, for making that choice without me, but also something else, something deeper that made me feel both protective and helpless. "Her name is Karen," Judy added quietly, as if that would make it more real for me. "I know this is a lot to ask, but, please. I wouldn't come to you if I didn't have to." I felt a whirlwind of emotions, rage, confusion, disbelief, all crashing over me at once. But beneath all of it, there was a strange sense of responsibility. Despite everything, this was my child. My daughter. Without meeting Judy's eyes, I managed to find my voice, though it came out barely more than a whisper. "I need time to think about this." She nodded, understanding, before quietly gathering her things and leaving me alone, still grappling with the impossible truth of it all. After Judy left, I sat in that coffee shop for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, my mind racing. A daughter. The thought kept circling in my head, pulling me in 1,000 directions at once. I had a daughter, and she was sick. A child I'd never met, a life I'd been kept from for 6 whole years. The shock of it was overwhelming. Part of me wanted to walk away. After everything Judy had put me through, I couldn't believe she had the nerve to show up after all this time, practically demanding something so monumental from me. She'd already stolen years of my daughter's life from me, years I could never get back. And now, she was asking me to risk my health for a child she'd hidden from me? But then there was Karen. It didn't matter that I hadn't known her, hadn't watched her grow up or been there for her first words, her first steps. None of it was her fault. She was my daughter, whether I'd known about her or not, and she was in trouble. As the initial storm of anger faded, something new settled over me, a feeling of responsibility, of protectiveness. Despite everything, I couldn't turn my back on her. But I knew I couldn't just give in to Judy's request so easily, either. There were boundaries, rights I hadn't been given but that I needed now if I was going to step into Karen's life. The next day, I texted Judy to meet me again. This time, I was ready. When she showed up, she looked relieved, as if my response had been the one thing she'd been waiting on. But I didn't waste any time getting to the point. "I'll consider helping," I told her, my tone steady, "but only if you agree to give up your parental rights to Karen." Her expression turned to shock, and then, slowly, to understanding. "You want custody?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. If I'm going to be a part of her life, I want all of it. No more secrets. No more lies. For a moment, she looked down, struggling to hold herself together. Then, with a small nod, she looked back up, defeated. All right, Archie. If that's what it takes, then, yes. With that agreement, something settled within me. For the first time since learning the truth, I felt a glimmer of control. A sense that, despite everything that had happened, I could still do right by my daughter. After Judy agreed to give up her parental rights, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I had a long road ahead, but now I had a purpose that felt solid, something bigger than anything I'd faced. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Karen. And if I was going to be in her life, I had to be ready for everything that would come with it. I didn't just need to show up. I needed to build a stable life that she could depend on. The first thing I did was reach out to a lawyer. I wanted everything in writing. Full custody, Judy's legal agreement to relinquish her rights, the works. I needed to make sure that nothing could jeopardize my role in Karen's life once I'd committed. We talked through the details, laid out what my rights would be, and planned how I could start the adoption process if things worked out. There was a sense of relief that came from having a legal foundation in place, from knowing that I was taking this step in a way that would protect Karen, and me in the long run. Next, I threw myself into preparing my home for Karen. The spare room became her room. I bought a bed, picked out furniture, even took a crash course in kids' decor from a friend who'd recently decorated for his own daughter. I didn't know much about Karen's likes or dislikes, but I'd heard she loved books, so I made sure to get a small shelf and fill it with kids' stories. Each item I added to her room made it feel more real. This idea that I had a daughter, that I'd be stepping in as her parent. But beyond the practical, I knew I needed to be emotionally prepared. I hadn't raised a kid, and I didn't have a guide for how to go from zero to being a father to a 6-year-old. I reached out to friends who had kids, soaking up every piece of advice I could get. They shared stories about bedtime routines, about the importance of patience, of setting boundaries but being gentle. Some advice I took with a grain of salt, but a lot of it stayed with me. I wasn't just preparing a room, I was preparing myself to be a real dad. Throughout this, Lily was there too, helping where she could. She'd come over, bring coffee, offer suggestions, and sometimes just listen when I needed to vent. Her support made all the difference. I was stepping into something huge, and her calm, steady presence reminded me that I wasn't doing it alone. She never pushed, never pried. She was simply there, quietly encouraging me through the moments when I doubted myself. In a matter of weeks, I'd gone from shocked and unprepared to having a plan, a vision for a new life. Every step forward gave me a little more confidence. I knew there were challenges waiting for me that I couldn't anticipate, but I also knew that I'd face them head-on. By the time I was ready to meet Karen, I'd rebuilt my life in a way I never thought possible. The day finally came. After weeks of preparation and 1,000 sleepless nights imagining how it might go, I was finally going to meet Karen, my daughter. I felt ready, or as ready as anyone could be in a situation like this. My nerves were a mix of excitement and fear, a constant hum in the background as I waited in the small, brightly colored room at the hospital. Judy had arranged the meeting, and I knew it wouldn't be easy, but all I could focus on was finally seeing her. When the door opened, I saw a nurse gently guiding a small, pale girl with dark, curious eyes. She looked around the room as if taking everything in, her expression both cautious and curious. My heart hammered as she came in, and for a moment, she seemed to hesitate, looking at me with a hint of uncertainty. "Hi, Karen," I said softly, keeping my voice calm and steady, though my heart was racing. "I'm Archie." It felt strange not to say, "Oh, I'm your dad," but I didn't want to overwhelm her with labels. She looked at me for a long moment, studying my face, as if searching for something familiar. "Hi," she whispered back, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. She clutched a small stuffed animal in her hands, a worn-looking bunny missing one ear, and held it tightly against her chest. We sat in silence for a few seconds, and I could see the shyness in her eyes. I wanted to make this easy for her, to show her I was someone she could trust. "I heard you like stories," I ventured, trying to break the ice. "I have some books at home that I think you might like." Her eyes brightened just a little, a flicker of interest breaking through her reserve. "I like fairy tales," she said, her voice still soft but more open. "Fairy tales, huh?" I smiled. letting the relief show in my face. "I think I've got a whole shelf of them just waiting for you." She hugged her bunny tighter, seeming to warm up to the idea, and for a moment, I could see a small smile fighting to appear. "Do you have The Little Mermaid?" she asked, her eyes glancing up at me. "I sure do," I said, feeling a surge of joy at our first real connection. "And probably a few others you haven't read yet." We talked for a little while about stories and the kinds of things she liked. She was quiet, but every now and then, I'd see her guard drop just a little, a tiny piece of her personality shining through. I noticed she was observant, picking up on small details in the room, like the color of the walls or the shape of the chair I was sitting in. There was a quiet intelligence about her that made me want to get to know her even more. After a while, she seemed to grow a bit more comfortable, and I took a chance, reaching out my hand toward her. She hesitated but, after a moment, put her tiny hand in mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. A sign that maybe, just maybe, she was willing to trust me. The nurse came in to tell us visiting time was over, and my heart sank, but I smiled, not wanting to show how hard it was to leave. "I'll see you again soon, Karen. Maybe next time, we can read The Little Mermaid together, if you'd like." She nodded, clutching her bunny to her chest and looking at me with a quiet gaze that spoke more than words could. "Okay," she whispered, her small voice carrying a hint of hope. As I left the hospital, I felt a mixture of emotions I hadn't expected. Joy, sadness, and a deep, fierce protectiveness. I'd only spent a short time with her, but it was enough to know one thing for sure. Karen was my daughter, and I'd do whatever it took to make sure she knew she was safe, loved, and never alone again. After meeting Karen, something shifted in me. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the quiet strength in her eyes and the way she clutched that worn-out bunny as if it was the last piece of comfort in the world. I wanted to give her more than just comfort. I wanted to give her a life full of confidence, resilience, and the kind of opportunities that would open every door for her. I wanted her to know she was capable of anything, and I didn't want her to grow up feeling limited by her health or anything else. That night, I sat down at my desk and made a plan, a roadmap for her future. It might have seemed ambitious, but I was ready to give this everything I had. If she was going to make it through this transplant and whatever came after, I wanted her to emerge with a future full of possibilities, a world where she could say yes to whatever life offered. I didn't just want her to survive. I wanted her to thrive. The first step was setting up a college fund. I hadn't really thought about kids or their futures before, but now it felt like the most important thing in the world. I wanted her to have access to the best education, whether that meant a university, an art school, or a program that would help her explore her passions. I set aside a portion of my savings and started researching different options, even though she was only 6. It felt good, knowing I was putting down roots for her. Then, I thought about the more immediate future. Karen was smart and observant, and I knew she had an interest in reading and stories. I wanted to nurture that, to give her a foundation that would spark her creativity and build her confidence. I decided to set up a little learning corner in our home, with books, art supplies, and puzzles. Anything that could help her explore the world in her own way. And it wasn't just about the material things. I started thinking about ways to encourage her to speak up, to feel comfortable expressing her thoughts and dreams. I remembered how quiet she'd been during our meeting, how shy and reserved. I wanted her to know that her voice mattered and that she never had to shrink herself down or hold back her ideas. I resolved to spend time each day with her, reading together, drawing, or just talking about her day. Small things, but things that would help her grow into a young woman who was unafraid to take up space in the world. As the days went by, I felt more and more committed to this goal. I didn't want to make her life easy necessarily, but I wanted to make sure she had every tool to handle whatever life threw at her. I didn't want her to feel the way I had when I discovered her existence. Caught off guard, overwhelmed, unprepared. She was going to have the foundation she needed, so that when she faced choices and challenges, she could move forward with confidence, knowing that she had the strength and support to overcome anything. It wasn't about controlling her future. It was about opening doors for her, so that when the time came, she could choose her own path. For the first time, I felt like I was building something bigger than myself, something lasting, something meaningful. As I finalized the details of my plan, I looked around our home and imagined it through Karen's eyes. I thought about how, one day, she'd come to know every corner of this place and see it as her own. And I realized that, in a way, she was making me better too. This plan wasn't just for her future, it was shaping mine as well. I felt more grounded, more determined than ever. Whatever it took, I was ready to make sure Karen never had to say no to her dreams. Years passed, and somehow, I'd managed to build a life I never imagined I'd have. Looking back, I could hardly recognize the man I'd been when Judy first showed up with that bombshell revelation. I had spent every moment since then trying to create the kind of life that Karen, my daughter, deserved. One full of stability, love, and opportunity. And somewhere along the way, I'd ended up with a life that made me genuinely happy. Karen grew up into an incredible young girl, full of life, curiosity, and quiet strength. Watching her come out of her shell over the years was like watching a flower bloom, one petal at a time. She'd gone from the shy child clutching a worn-out bunny to a confident, creative girl with a love for stories and art. Every moment I'd invested in her, every small decision I made to empower her, had brought us closer and helped her grow into herself. At home, her little learning corner turned into a full-fledged study area over time, packed with books, art supplies, and little projects she was always working on. She'd often come to me with a drawing or a story she'd written, and I'd listen to her excitedly explain every detail, her eyes lighting up with pride. Watching her so engaged, so sure of herself, made everything worth it. She was growing into the kind of person who could take on the world. But it wasn't just Karen who had transformed. My own life had taken off in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Work had gone well, exceptionally well, in fact. I'd been given opportunities that boosted my career and my finances, and I'd taken them with both hands. I'd invested smartly, made connections, and even found myself heading up a division within my company. The success that had come from hard work, perseverance, and a touch of luck had set us up with a level of financial security I could have only dreamed of years ago. One of the perks of that success? I finally bought the car I'd wanted since I was a teenager. A sleek, classic 1967 Mustang, fully restored and roaring like a dream. The first time I took it out, I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years, a mix of nostalgia and pride. I took Karen for a ride in it, and she giggled the whole time, her hair whipping around as we sped down the open road. She'd hang her head out of the window and shout, "Faster, Dad," and I'd laugh, stepping on the gas just a little bit more. Those rides became something special between us. Just me and her, a father and daughter sharing simple, pure joy. And then, there was Lily. She'd been by my side through so much, supporting me quietly at first, then eventually as something more. What started as a deep friendship had blossomed into the kind of love I'd always hoped for. She and Karen got along like they were meant to be in each other's lives. Karen trusted her, and Lily loved her like her own. Together, the three of us made a little family that felt solid, like it was meant to last. Our life wasn't extravagant, but it was comfortable. I had my dream car, the home I'd rebuilt to be a sanctuary for Karen and me, and a job that provided stability. Most importantly, though, I had people who made life feel meaningful. Lily, who was the love of my life, and Karen, who was my heart. Every now and then, I'd sit back and realize just how far we'd come. The betrayal, the heartache, the challenges, they'd all become a distant memory, a part of the past that had ultimately shaped us but didn't define us. What mattered now was the present, the love we shared, and the promise of a future where anything was possible. In the quiet moments, I'd look around at my life and realize just how lucky I was. I had everything I'd ever dreamed of, and the best part was that Karen, Lily, and I had built it together. And for the first time, I didn't just feel at peace. I felt truly, deeply happy.